The Moonstone Hall was suffocating. Every breath Elara took tasted of dried pine needles and the desperate, cloying scent of political formality, an attempt by the Silver Moon Pack to mask the volatile mix of expectation and underlying resentment that always accompanied such a grand ceremony. The hall itself was a fortress of crystalline granite, polished to reflect the overhead moon simulacrum, casting stark, unforgiving light on everything, especially on her. Let us know where you're watching us from. And would you like to watch part 2? Elara, the Omega, stood centered on the polished floor, a startling anomaly. Her hair was not the common ash or auburn of the pack, but a stark, shimmering silver white, cascading like a waterfall of frozen moonlight. Her eyes, unnervingly pale, seemed to hold the cold depth of the winter sky. For 18 years, she had carried the weight of this deviation, trying to make herself small, hoping her purity in spirit could somehow outweigh the visual flaw that had earned her the constant biting whispers of the pack. Today, she had only one prayer left, that her fated mate, whoever he might be, would be a wolf of sufficient standing and loyalty to finally shield her from the centuries-old scorn. A hush fell, heavy and complete. Then, the newly crowned alpha, Damon, strode toward her. He was a perfect specimen, all sculpted muscle, dark, commanding height, and eyes the color of a stormy sea. His power wasn't just physical. It was an internal pressure, an alpha aura that demanded subservience, making the hairs on the necks of every beta and omega prickle in instinctive submission. The moment he closed the distance, the atmosphere exploded. It wasn't a gentle flicker of recognition. The mate bond snapped into existence like a thunderbolt striking a bell, a high-pitched electric fusion of souls that was both violently agonizing and exquisitely consuming. It bypassed the flesh, went straight to the spirit, and knotted them together with white-hot, immortal thread. Elara's body locked, flooded with a fierce, blinding current of hope and unconditional belonging. She found herself reaching for him, a desperate, pure instinct driving her forward. But the light, the twin recognition that should have ignited a corresponding fire in Damon's gaze, was instantly extinguished. The sudden, agonizing hope in Elara's chest lasted less than a single shattering breath. His eyes, seconds ago filled with the neutral focus of command, were replaced by a deep, icy terror that radiated pure, unadulterated fear. The scent of his fear, sharp and acrid, cut through the pine sap and reverence, a bitter perfume only she, his newly linked mate, could truly distinguish. "You are not a mate," he hissed, his lips barely moving as he hauled her back, his alpha grip tightening on her arm with brutal, bruising force, dragging her violently out of sight behind the great ancestor tapestry. The ancient fabric, woven with the histories of powerful lunas and glorious alphas, felt like a wall separating her from the world and her from salvation. "You are a plague." His internal alpha aura demanded she submit, a paralyzing, invisible weight that pressed her spine against the cold stone. "The oracle just delivered her judgment," he confided, his voice a raw whisper of hatred and conspiracy. "Not to the pack, but to me, just before this farce began. I was desperate to ignore the whispers, the folklore, but it's real. The prophecy is real. A leader will rise from the Omegas, marked by the moon's flaw, a leader destined to usurp my throne." He spat the word usurp like a shard of broken glass. "I didn't find a Luna, Elara. I found a ticking time bomb tied to the very essence of the moon goddess, designed to ruin everything I fought to build." Damon was obsessed with power and legacy. The idea that his fated partner was prophesied to be his downfall drove him to manic desperation. His alpha lineage was too strong to simply kill his mate and risk the goddess's wrath. The backlash would shatter his pack's reputation and perhaps his sanity. "I cannot kill you cleanly," he continued, his voice regaining its calculated edge. But a panicked, cursed rejection, followed by a quick accident that the pack will understand. They already see you as flawed. This is merely the final proof of your inherent rot. He adjusted his ceremonial cloak, his mind already spinning the intricate narrative of his betrayal. The pack's collective belief in her curse would be his shield against both the goddess and the lingering suspicion of his own betas. With chilling detachment, he shoved her back out onto the polished stone floor, into the stark, reflecting light and the sight of the assembled pack. He drew himself up, inhaling deeply, and unleashed the full, terrifying might of his controlled voice. I, Alpha Damon of the Silver Moon Pack, reject you, Elara. The sound was a deafening, booming wave of disgust, magnified by the hall's granite walls, crashing over her ears and soul. The sheer volume of his alpha command was designed to crush her will, to sever the bond entirely and irrevocably. I reject your weakness, he roared, watching her wince. I reject this curse the moon goddess has tried to saddle me with. You are a stain on our line, an omen of decay. Your white fur is the color of bone and death. The words were meticulously chosen, calibrated to strike at the deepest fears and prejudices of the ancient pack hierarchy. Damon needed their collective disgust to be genuine. The entire hall gasped as one, a vast collective exhalation of shock and validation. Many of the elders nodded, their expressions confirming what they had always suspected. The white Omega was truly ill-fated. Before the sound of that terrible silence could fully settle, Damon gave the subtle, chilling nod. It was a flick of his eyes. An almost imperceptible signal directed toward two guards positioned near the ceremonial arches. They reacted instantly, moving not with the visible intent to restrain a rejected mate, but to block her panicked flight, effectively cornering her. Damon intended to make her frenzy appear so absolute that her accidental death at their hands would be tragically understandable. In that single, agonizing second, trapped between the psychic devastation of the rejection and the cold, absolute finality of the incoming assassination, Elara's soul didn't just weep, it fractured into a million pieces. Her deepest, most desperate terror triggered a raw, terrifying, primal surge of power she had suppressed all her life. It wasn't the shimmering, gentle silver of her eyes that reacted. It was the opposite. A chaotic, consuming burst of raw, midnight black shadow magic that erupted from her core. The power was not refined. It was need. It poured out of her, an uncontrolled tide of primordial darkness that defied the purity of the Moonstone Hall. It didn't heal her shattered bond. It shielded her. The air around her turned frigid and dense, crackling with an energy that ripped at the fabric of reality. The energy surge tore through the elegant ancestor tapestries, shredded the banners, and cracked the polished granite floor beneath her feet in jagged black lines. The force flung the two approaching guards back 20 feet, leaving searing dark energy burns on their skin. It was a display of power far more terrifying than any mere curse, instantly branding her as something unnatural, utterly formidable, and completely unforgivable by the greater packs. With the Moonstone Hall reeling in stunned horror and Damon's face pale with fury at his botched plot, Elara scrambled, her body wounded by the Alpha's rejection, her soul screaming from the illicit power she'd just unleashed. The raw instinct of her Omega wolf, usually docile, now screamed to flee. She dove under the edge of a shattered table, using the last dregs of the shadow energy to briefly mask her scent and outline. She fled toward the nearest exit, hearing the Alpha's immediate, calculating cover-up booming behind her, weaving the final thread of the lie. The rejection drove the cursed thing mad. The ancient power corrupted her. She has fled into the Whisperwood to die and decay. The lie was cemented, reinforced by the visible destruction of her frenzy. But her panicked, desperate use of dark magic had bought her life. branding her as a fugitive and forever sealing her fate to the lonely, dangerous shadows. She did not look back. Survival was the only law left. Chapter 2. Forge of the Shadow Crest. The taste of ash and betrayal lingered in Elara's mouth, a far more bitter poison than any she'd tasted in the wilds. Her expulsion from the Sunstone Pack hadn't just been a physical tearing away, it had been a surgical strike to her very identity. They had left her for the Whisperwood, a place where magic ran thin and desperation ran wild. They called it exile. She would call it boot camp. The unforgiving trial. The Whisperwood was a cynical joke of a forest. The trees were bone-pale and clawed, the shadows too deep, and the silence oppressive, broken only by the unsettling whispers that gave the wood its name. Elara, driven by a cold, relentless logic, didn't fight the darkness in her. She wore it. The forbidden shadow magic, once a shameful secret, became her only friend. It wasn't about lashing out, it was about vanishing. A flick of a thought, and her tawny fur seemed to drink the moonlight, leaving only a rippling distortion in her wake. Camouflage was survival, and every successful blink of invisibility was a defiant middle finger to the wolves who had cast her out. The broken and the misfits. It was in the heart of this gloom that she found her first follower, or rather her first survivor. A scrawny, trembling gray wolf named Kaelen, whose latent earth magic manifested as uncontrolled tremors, making him a walking disaster in a pack setting. Then came Elara, a beautiful, erratic she-wolf whose fire magic sometimes flared so brightly it singed the air, a terrifying liability for any established group. Elara saw not broken wolves, but unlicensed power. The Sunstone Pack saw a flaw, Elara rasped, her voice rough from disuse. But they were blind. You are not broken. You are simply too loud for their quiet little world. She took them in. Not out of misplaced kindness, but out of necessity. They needed a shield, and she needed a foundation. They were the unwanted, the volatile, the ones with a magic that simply refused to obey rules. A decade in the dark, the Shadow Crest. The next decade was a brutal, slow-motion struggle for legitimacy. Elara didn't just teach them to survive, she taught them to control their chaos. She showed Kaelen how the tremors could become subtle vibrations in the earth, a whisper of a warning. She taught Elara to choke her flame until it was nothing more than a spark, ready to ignite only on Elara's command. Her own shadow magic deepened. It became more than camouflage. It became a cloak of silence, a means of instant, absolute protection. They coalesced under her iron will, their forbidden powers weaving together to create something new, something terrifying to the uninitiated. The Shadow Crest Pack. They were a mirror image of the judgmental world that rejected them, only this time they held the reflection up with pride. The Sanctuary and the Iron Rule. Finally, driven by the realization that continuous wandering was continuous risk, Elara found the perfect location, a forgotten labyrinthine canyon choked with ancient twisted roots. She named it Haven. It was a beautiful lie, a hidden sanctuary built on the bitter truth that they were targets. As the self-appointed alpha, Elara's rules were few, but absolute. Silence is survival. Never use your magic outside of Haven. If you must, use Elara's shadow to shroud it. No wolf left behind. An attack on one is an attack on the crest. Loyalty is not a virtue. It is a necessary weapon. The law-abiding are the enemy. Never trust the pure packs. Their laws are simply chains. They seek to govern you. We seek to live. Elara stood on the highest root-tangled bluff, watching the sun set over her new domain. She wasn't an outcast anymore. She was a leader. She hadn't sought power, but it had found her in the deepest shadow. And she realized the chilling truth. The only way to be safe from the powerful was to become something more terrifying than they could imagine. Now, she thought, her amber eyes catching the moonlight. Let them come looking. Chapter 3. Blood on the Snow. 10 years. 10 years of calculated risk, enforced silence, and the ruthless efficiency of Elara's command. The Shadow Crest was no longer a collection of broken misfits. It was a sleek, deadly machine. Haven was their heartbeat, a fortress woven from roots and shadow, secure enough that even the most volatile of their number, Lyra, whose fire still flared, could live without constant fear of exposure. Elara, now the undisputed alpha, bore the passage of time not in wrinkles, but in a deepening of her shadow. Her fur was richer, her movements quieter, and her gaze held the chilling clarity of someone who had repeatedly chosen the necessary darkness over comforting light. She was their shield and their spear, and her rules were the sacred texts. And the first rule was always safety over sentiment. The static in the silence. It was the height of the first deep winter. The whisperwood was muffled by a heavy, unbroken snowfall, a pristine white that seemed to mock the deep, ugly secrets it hid. Elara was conducting a silent patrol, more for the discipline than the danger, when the cold silence began to feel wrong. It wasn't just the quiet of winter. It was the absence of life. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. It was a familiar, unwelcome feeling, the metallic tang of immediate danger cutting through the crisp air. Static, the kind of energetic signature that promised immense, brutal power. She stopped, lifting her muzzle to the falling snow. "Kyle," she spoke, her voice a low thrum that bypassed the air and seemed to vibrate the ground beneath her Earth Mage second. "Send the deep scouts. South run, now. Tell them to bring back information, not trouble. If they sense anything larger than a Sunstone Elder, they fade and run." Kael gave a terse nod, his usual nervous tremor completely absent when receiving a direct order. The control Elara had instilled in them was absolute. The carnage. The deep scouts, 3 of the fastest, most magically muted wolves in the crest, returned just before dawn, their fur frosted, their eyes wide and horrified. "Alpha!" the lead scout, Torvin, gasped, shaking snow from his pelt. "South of the White Peaks, the rogue territories." "Speak plainly, Torvin," Elara commanded, her voice dangerously calm. "It wasn't a fight, Alpha. It was execution." Torvin swallowed hard. "A dozen rogues, maybe more. Torn apart. Not by claws, Alpha. By strategy. They were corralled, separated, and systematically neutralized." Lyra, standing by the fire, hissed, her flame suddenly a shade brighter. "Who would bother hunting rogues like that? They're just noise." "Someone who practices, Lyra," Elara corrected, her mind racing, discarding possibilities one after another. "Someone who wants a clean slate, or someone who wants to send a message." "And a message was left," Torvin continued, lowering his head. "We found him. The rogue pack's Alpha, we think. He's not just big Alpha. He's immense, like a shadow on the snow, black as pitch, twice the size of Kael. And," Elara pressed, "near death. Guts out, bleeding into the snow. But that's not what killed his pack. It was the wounds." Torvin shuddered. "Silver, Alpha. The claws of the hunters, the ones the old stories warn about, the ones who only target high alphas." The Black Wolf. The discovery sent a cold spike of dread through Haven. Silver was not a threat from the traditional law-abiding packs, the Sunstone or the Skyclaw. Silver was the tool of the exterminators, the secretive, merciless human hunters who believed wolf magic was a plague to be cleansed, and they didn't waste silver on common rogues. Elara knew exactly what this meant. The enormous Black Wolf was not a rogue. He was someone of massive importance, a high alpha who had lost his pack, his territory, and his health to an enemy far too coordinated for a simple dispute. He is a beacon, Elara realized with sickening clarity. A trail marker. She went to him herself, taking only Kael and Elara. The scene of the carnage was sickeningly efficient, a lesson in brutal geometry. Every rogue was dead exactly where they had been cornered. Then she saw the Black Wolf. He was a myth, made real. Even on the verge of death, the sheer crushing density of his magical aura was palpable. His fur was the color of a moonless night, and he was indeed bleeding heavily. Elara focused not on the blood, but on the wounds, deep, cauterizing gashes, silver. The poison was already working, turning his potent magic against him. Kael whispered, "We have to leave him, Alpha. His scent is like a flare. If we touch him, if we help him, they'll follow the silver trails right back to Haven." This was the core of Elara's decade-long philosophy. Caution must override all else. They were the Shadow Crest, built on the principle of secrecy. One reckless act could dismantle years of careful, calculated silence and expose every broken, powerful wolf she protected. The override. But then, the Black Wolf shifted. His immense head lifted, his golden eyes, the size of walnuts, lidded with pain. He didn't snarl. He didn't beg. He simply looked at Elara, and in that fleeting, agonizing moment, she saw not an enemy or a risk, but a reflection. He was power, wounded and betrayed. He was alone. Elara flashed back to the day the Sunstone Alpha had banished her, to the cold, superior look in his eyes. She remembered the sheer, white-hot unfairness of being cast out for something she couldn't control. They want him dead, she thought. They want him silenced and erased. Her compassion, the soft, traitorous thing she thought she had buried under a decade of iron will, roared to life. It wasn't true pity, it was defiance. Saving this wolf was the ultimate act of rebellion against the hunters, against the law-abiding packs, and against the very system that had exiled her. "No," Elara said, the word cutting through the snow-muffled air like a shard of ice. "We are not leaving him." Lyra stepped forward, her flame flickering nervously. "Alpha, this is suicide. He's too big. The risk—" "I know the risk," Elara interrupted, her voice gaining the Alpha's absolute resonance. "The exterminators are a plague. They seek to remove the most powerful among us. If they kill him, they are emboldened. If we save him, we gain a debt, a weapon, and an immediate colossal target." She lowered her muzzle and nudged the Black Wolf's flank. He was heavy. Impossibly so. "Kael, Lyra," Elara commanded, her shadow magic already stretching out, not just to conceal, but to begin the arduous task of moving a beast twice their size. "We move him. Slowly. Use the shadow. Mute the scent. Mute the pain. We bring the darkness home." She looked at the bleeding, majestic wolf. Her sanctuary, built on the foundations of cold caution, was about to house the most dangerous secret in the wolf world. The Shadow Crest's decade of peace was officially over. "Welcome to Haven," she thought grimly. "Let the games begin." That sets up a thrilling dynamic. Elara has deliberately introduced a massive, unknown element of danger into her controlled environment, driven by a deep-seated rejection of the system that created her. Chapter 4. The Unmasking. The arrival of the immense Black Wolf ripped the measured quiet from Haven. The air was thick with the scent of pine, blood, and a raw, untamed power that was utterly antithetical to the hidden sanctuary Elara had painstakingly built. The danger wasn't outside the walls, it was bleeding out on her healing floor. The forbidden ritual. Elara and her most trusted lieutenants, Kael and Lyra, worked with a desperate, frantic energy. They had stripped the Black Wolf's wounds of the clotted snow, revealing the deep, jagged incisions left by the silver. "The silver is poisoning him," Lyra hissed, her hands hovering, crackling with barely contained fire magic. "It's attacking his core. We need to purge it before it shunts his magic into total failure." "We can't touch it with fire. It'll spread the toxins faster," Elara said, her voice tight with strain. She was crouched beside the colossal creature, Her shadow magic not just for camouflage anymore, but for containment. She needed to hold his fraying life force together long enough for the actual healing. She pressed her muzzle against his flank, releasing a flood of concentrated shadow energy. It wasn't a destructive force, it was a binding one. The shadow enveloped the wound, isolating the toxic silver like a shield. Kael, his earth magic usually reserved for fortifying walls, was instructed to draw the silver out. He focused, trembling not from nerves, but from the sheer force of his will, channeling his energy deep into the wound. He was pulling the physical fragments, coaxing the metal from the meat. It was a meticulous, agonizing process. With every tiny silver shard Kael drew out, the black wolf let out a rattling, low growl that shook the very roots of their sanctuary. Elara then used her fire, choked down to a sterile blue-white flame, to instantly sterilize and cauterize the tiny holes, preventing secondary infection. Elara was the linchpin. Her shadow magic had to be perfect, a tireless net holding the wolf's power in check and stabilizing his life force, ensuring the volatile magic of her two lieutenants didn't kill him faster. The resurgence days blurred into a single, frantic, sleepless ordeal. They fed him their choicest cuts of hunted meat, crushed herbs into his broth, and maintained the constant draining flow of magic. It was in the dead of the third night, when the black wolf's breathing had become shallow and ragged, that Elara felt the shift. Kael had pulled the last visible shard. Elara had sealed the final wound. Elara was just about to pull her magic back, ready for the wave of exhaustion to finally hit her, when the residual force field she had woven around the wolf clanged. It was not a sound she heard, but a vibration that resonated deep within her chest, in a place she had kept locked and barred for a decade. It was the absolute, undeniable, deafening sound of a mate bond slamming into existence. It was instantaneous and overwhelming. Boom. It wasn't a tentative whisper or a gentle tug. It was a collision, a physical, consuming force that knocked the air from her lungs and sent a white-hot electrical current screaming through her veins. It demanded recognition. It demanded possession. This was no shadow of a bond, no weak, broken attempt like the pathetic, easily severed link she'd shared with Damon. This was an alpha bond, an ancient, profound, and utterly commanding connection that felt like the two of them were the only solid things left in a world melting around them. No. No, no, no. Elara scrambled backward, her shadow magic flickering wildly, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I forbid this!" The strength of it terrified her. Damon's bond had been fragile because he was weak. This one was unbreakable because this wolf, despite being near death, possessed a terrifying, inherent strength. This wasn't just a powerful alpha. This was the most powerful she had ever encountered. She focused fiercely on the bitter memory of Damon's betrayal, trying to use the icy shards of her past to reject the overwhelming heat of the present. It was useless. The bond ignored her pain and her will, settling into her core like a massive anchoring weight. The fever breaks. The mate bond wasn't the only change. With the silver purged and the bond initiated, the Black Wolf's natural, powerful magic roared back to life, flooding his system. His body began to convulse, steam rising from his thick fur. The fever was breaking, but the intense resurgence of power threatened to burn him alive. "He's shifting!" Elara yelled, stumbling back. "Kael, brace the room!" Kael quickly slammed his paws down, reinforcing the earthen floor and root walls around the massive creature. The Black Wolf's massive form shuddered, shrinking and contorting in the violent throes of the transformation. Bone structure cracked and reassembled, fur receded, replaced by smooth, sweat-slicked skin. The sheer size of the wolf translated into a man of immense muscular stature. When the transformation was complete, a large, naked man lay sprawled on the furs, his chest rising and falling in deep, even breaths. Elara, frozen by the sudden shift in atmosphere and the agonizing pull of the mate bond, could only stare. The man was magnificent. Sculpted shoulders, a broad chest, and hair the color of midnight. He was beautiful in a dangerous, absolute sense. And then she saw his face. The king. As the light from the small hearth flickered across his features, Elara's breath hitched, the icy clarity of sheer terror eclipsing the heat of the bond. The man's profile was unmistakable, etched into every wanted poster, painted on every great hall banner, and known to every wolf on the continent. He was King Kaelen, not a high alpha. The sovereign of the entire continental pack. The legendary King Kaelen, famed across the lands for his absolute iron rule, his military dominance, and his relentless, zealous purification of the territories from any form of dark or shadow magic. Elara's world tilted. Every principle she had ever sworn to, every rule she had ever enforced, shattering instantly. She, the alpha of the banished Shadow Crest, the architect of a sanctuary built entirely on forbidden shadow magic, had just used that very magic to save the life of the only man in the world who would, without hesitation, condemn her and every wolf under her protection to death. And the worst of it? He was her mate. Damon was a traitor. This one is an executioner. Elara stood paralyzed, the mate bond thrumming a fierce counterpoint to the dread in her heart. She hadn't just rescued a wolf. She had dragged the continent's most powerful, most dangerous enemy right into the heart of her secret. "Alpha?" Lyra whispered, sensing the colossal shift in Elara's demeanor. Who is he?" Elara could barely speak past the crushing weight in her throat. She simply pointed at the man who was now, impossibly, bound to her soul. "He," Elara managed, the word a rasp of broken glass, "is the one wolf who can destroy us all." Chapter 5. Whispers of Treason. The air in Haven's root chamber was thick enough to chew. Elara stared at the face of King Kaelen, the mate bond thrumming a fierce, undeniable melody that she ruthlessly drowned out with the screech of pure, tactical terror. Her reflection was staring back at the king, a woman of shadow magic, the only living witness to his near death, and now, his involuntary soulmate. "Lyra, Kael, out!" Elara ordered, her voice flat, devoid of the familiar alpha resonance. She needed to think, and their hypervigilance was too loud. Once alone, Elara approached Kaelen. He was sitting up, his massive shoulders still taut with residual silver pain, but his mind was clearly already on the war, the interrogation of a king. "The mate bond is irrelevant," Elara stated, bypassing all courtesy. "We focus on your survival and the safety of my pack. Do not mistake my actions for devotion. I saved a powerful asset, not a spouse." Kaelen didn't take offense. He simply nodded, his eyes assessing. "A practical assessment. I respect it. Now we talk facts. You know who I am. You know my laws regarding your magic. But my immediate concern is a traitor who is currently running my kingdom." He began to speak, his voice a low, commanding baritone that effortlessly laid out the intricate tapestry of a conspiracy. Elara, alpha of the exiled, listened to the sovereign of the continent recount his near-fatal failure. "For nearly 6 months, I have been tracking unusual energy drain from the capital's magical reserves, whispers of powerful ancient artifacts being moved. The trail was obscured, but it kept leading back to a handful of disgruntled minor nobility. And at the end of that leash," Kaelen paused, his gaze hardening, "was a wolf named Damon." Elara's jaw tightened. She felt the icy shock of recognition travel through the mate bond, a sharp, unwelcome spike of shared memory. Damon. Always Damon. "Damon, a disgraced former Sunstone officer," Kaelen continued, oblivious to the extent of Elara's connection to the name. He was a useful fool to the conspirators. He had connections to the border packs, a weak profile, and a history of being easily manipulated. The royal beta, Thane, swore he was hunting Damon for me, chasing down the rumors of corruption. Thane was doing the corrupting himself. Kaelen confirmed Elara's worst fears. I was following Damon's staged trail when Thane's assassins struck. They used silver, a technique adopted from the exterminators, a tool for silent, untraceable removal of powerful alphas. Thane believed that by removing me, Damon could be blamed for the ensuing chaos, giving Thane a clean path to the throne once he put down the rebellion. Elara felt a cold fury settle in her core. Damon wasn't just a bitter memory. He was a key figure in a continental coup. Her expulsion, her pain, the entire decade of secrecy, it all stemmed from the ripple effects of this petty, treasonous wolf. So, you were not ambushed by rogues, Elara summarized, her voice dangerously quiet. You were betrayed by your most trusted beta, and the single greatest fugitive in the realm is the man who ruined my life 10 years ago. Kaelen's immense chest rose on a deep breath. The irony is not lost on me, Alpha Elara. We are now bound by the same list of enemies: Thane, the conspirators, and Damon. The shadow and the reckoning. Now came the inevitable collision, her forbidden magic. Elara leaned closer, testing the limits of the king's gratitude. We used shadow binding and energy manipulation to save you. Magic your laws condemn as dark and chaotic. Every wolf in this sanctuary is subject to execution under your decree. Kaelen met her gaze without flinching. I am aware of the magic used. It stabilized my life force, something my royal physicians could not have done without exposing me. He studied her face, her discipline, the palpable control she exerted over her pack. His silence was unnerving. He didn't offer praise, nor did he offer immediate condemnation. He offered a profound, unsettling pragmatism. Alpha Elara, Kaelen finally spoke, his voice grave. I was taught that fire burns wildly, but I saw Lyra control a sterile, cleansing flame. I was taught that earth magic is slow, but I saw Kael precisely extract silver. And I was taught that shadow magic is pure entropy. Yet yours provided the absolute stability that saved my life. I have seen the control you possess, and I will not let ideological dogma blind me to the reality of power when the throne is at stake. It was a brilliant evasion, an acknowledgement of utility without a formal retraction of his laws. Elara understood. Her magic was acceptable only as long as it was useful to the king. The political gauntlet Kaelen knew he was a ticking clock. Every day he spent healing was a day Thane used to solidify his false reign. I need to move, Kaelen asserted. Thane believes me dead. That window is short. I have sent a highly coded signal to 3 loyalist alphas. We rendezvous at the Broken Peak Pass. Good, Elara said, already planning the logistics of hiding the king's enormous presence. No, Alpha Elara. We rendezvous at the Broken Peak Pass, Kaelen corrected, his voice leaving no room for argument. You and the Shadow Crest will accompany me. Elara felt her blood run cold. That is non-negotiable, Your Majesty. My pack does not leave Haven. We are an army of secrecy. You expose us. You condemn us. Kaelen's immense frame shifted, and he leaned in, the full crushing force of his alpha command and the mate bond fusing into one undeniable wave. I am the single greatest piece of evidence that Thane is a traitor, Kaelen stated. You are the single greatest living piece of evidence that I am alive. If I leave you here, Thane will find you. He will scour this territory to eliminate all witnesses. Your sanctuary will be found, and it will be eradicated. This place will become a funeral pyre, not a haven. He paused, letting the brutal, inescapable logic sink in. Conversely, Kaelen continued, his voice softening just enough to be chillingly persuasive. If you accompany me, you become my immediate guard, my living shield. My enemies cannot touch you without openly attacking the king. You will be feared, hated, and whispered about, but you will be safe. You will be vulnerable, yes, but only I can protect you from the system that created your exile. You and your pack are now my immediate, ultimate responsibility. It was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. Elara was being forced from the shadows not as a supplicant, but as an integral, visible component of the king's power structure. She was walking straight back into the world that rejected her, but this time, with the continent's sovereign tethered to her side. Elara finally gave a sharp, reluctant nod. Her pack's survival demanded this move, no matter how much her instincts screamed against trusting Kaelen. "We move at moonrise," Elara commanded, her voice regaining its strength, infused now with a new, terrifying authority. "But understand this, Your Majesty. The mate bond binds us, but if you betray the Shadow Crest, I will sever it, and I will sever your throat with the same precision." The king merely gave a small, powerful nod. "A fair condition, Alpha. Now let us begin this dance of treason." The Shadow Crest was no longer an island of exiles. They were a weapon pointed at the heart of the continent, and the only person who knew how to wield them was the woman who feared the wielder most. The journey into the political gauntlet was about to begin. Chapter 6. A Gilded Cage. The journey from the hidden gloom of the Whisperwood to the meeting point at Broken Peak Pass had been a masterclass in controlled paranoia. Elara had employed every trick of the Shadow Crest, scent masking, deep shadow cloaks, and a silence so profound it felt like a hole in the soundscape. King Kaelen, still healing but moving with formidable grace, had observed it all with an unnerving intensity. He said nothing about their methods, but his eyes never missed a single flicker of their forbidden power. The encounter with Kaelen's loyalist alphas, 3 pack leaders who had sworn to the crown, was a trial by fire. Their alphas, clean-furred and regal, had regarded Elara and her scarred, shadow-infused wolves with open contempt and deep suspicion. "Shadow Crest," one had sneered, his nose wrinkling. "The exiles." Kaelen had settled the matter with a single, crushing glare. "They saved the crown. They are my immediate guard. Any insult to them is treason to me." His protection was absolute and utterly chilling. Arrival at the capital. The true shock came not from the loyalists, but from the destination itself. The capital citadel, a fortress carved from gleaming white granite, towering against the winter sky like a jewel-encrusted tooth. The capital was a world of suffocating light and opulence, the exact antithesis of Haven. As they entered the city, the Shadow Crest wolves were overwhelmed. They were used to earth, root, and shadow. The streets here were polished stone, the light too bright, the air thick with perfume and the competing scents of 1,000 clean-fliving wolves. Elara felt the dread rise in her pack. Kyle, his earth magic making him sensitive to the unnatural geometry, walked with a deep, visible unease. Lyra looked physically ill, the bright decorative lamps around them seeming to threaten her controlled flame. "We are a stain on this perfection," Elara thought grimly, "and everyone here knows it." They were escorted not to the dungeons, but to the royal guest wing, a gilded cage of staggering proportion. The rooms were layered in silks, carved wood, and crystal, utterly devoid of the comforting dirt and shadows they knew. Isolation and scrutiny. Elara immediately enforced strict rules. No magic, not a flicker. Stay within the confines of the wing. Do not speak unless spoken to. Yet, the isolation was a torture. The wolves of the Shadow Crest were used to a life of perpetual vigilance, but in Haven, vigilance was their strength. Here, Surrounded by silent, armed royal guards and the constant judgmental scrutiny of the capital's nobility, their vigilance became a suffocating liability. They felt their power, the very thing that defined them, was a ticking bomb. "Alpha," Kael murmured to Elara one evening, his eyes darting to the polished marble floor. "The scent. It's clean, but it's too strong. Too many eyes. I can't tell a genuine threat from a curious servant. We are exposed." "We are protected, Kael," Elara corrected, though the lie felt flimsy even to her. "We are the king's guard. We endure the gilded cage until we have what we need." The strategic partnership. Elara spent her days not resting, but working with Kaelen. The king, still relying on her for discretion, had immediately plunged into the crisis, working to untangle Thane's treacherous web before the coup became irreversible. Elara was astonished by Kaelen's mind. He was meticulous, relentless, and possessed a chilling, comprehensive view of the entire territory. But what truly surprised her was his willingness to listen to her. "Thane's initial targets are the border packs, not the capital." "Why?" Kaelen asked, sketching troop movements on a vast map. "Because the border packs are independent and politically fractured," Elara replied instantly, drawing on a decade of avoiding them. "If Thane captures them, he gains their immense territory and a buffer against any loyalist counterattack. The capital packs will submit to whoever holds the most land." Kaelen paused, his gold eyes locking onto hers, the mate bond humming with an unmistakable current of respect. "You see the strategic landscape, Alpha. Your exile was truly a criminal waste." Elara's strategic prowess was undeniable. She was a master of survival, and survival politics were proving ruthlessly effective in the royal court. Their working dynamic was electric, two formidable minds, driven by different codes, perfectly synchronized toward a single goal, reclaiming the crown. The unspoken protection. The central tension, however, was always present. Every time their hands brushed over a map, the mate bond flared, a profound, consuming heat that made Elara question everything she believed about her own broken heart. It wasn't just physical desire. It was a deep, intuitive understanding. Kaelen used this bond. Subtly, wordlessly, he provided Elara protection. During council meetings with the hostile loyalists, he would often place his hand on her shoulder or flank, a proprietary, unmistakable gesture that told the room, "She is mine. Back off." He gave her power without titles. He gave her safety without promises. He was ensuring her survival because the mate bond demanded it, and because her strategic mind was invaluable. But Kaelen remained terrifyingly silent on the subject of shadow magic. He accepted the presence of the Shadow Crest. He relied on Elara's counsel. He was bound to her by fate, but he never, ever uttered a word that rescinded his law. The fear of rejection. Elara knew the truth. She was a necessary evil. She was the inconvenient weapon, the powerful asset he needed to win his throne back. But her inherent power, the shadow magic that defined her and protected her pack, remained a capital offense in his kingdom. One night, finding herself alone in her opulent room, Elara shifted, needing the comfort of her wolf form. She caught her reflection in a massive gilded mirror, a sleek, dark wolf, a living embodiment of the forbidden. She looked at the luxury surrounding her and felt the gnawing fear that transcended any political threat. Kaelen was healing quickly. His strength was returning to a terrifying absolute zenith. Soon, he would no longer need the Shadow Crest's discreet shadow magic. Soon, he would be sovereign again. The mate bond was a gilded cage, beautiful and confining. Elara pressed her muzzle to the cool marble, a raw, primal dread settling in her stomach. Once he is king, she thought. The realization heavy as lead, once the coup is defeated and he is safe. Will he look at me, his mate, his council, his rescuer, and see only the shadow he must purge from his kingdom? The truth was an agonizing spike. She and her pack were living under a death sentence, issued by the very man who held her heart in his massive healing hand. The tension had to break, and Elara suspected the break would be catastrophic. Chapter 7. The Trap is Sprung. The capital citadel, for all its marble and majesty, had become nothing more than an exquisitely appointed waiting room for the inevitable. The Shadow Crest wolves were fraying under the constant pressure of invisibility. Elara, however, had found a terrible, brittle peace in the chaos. Working alongside Kaelen, she had learned his rhythms, the subtle tells of his focus, and the demanding, resonant thrum of the mate bond that, against her every will, was beginning to feel less like a shackle and more like an anchor. But the silence on the matter of her shadow magic remained. That terrifying, unwavering silence was the true sword hanging over her head. She knew the moment Kaelen was fully healed, the moment she was no longer necessary, that sword would fall. The Grand Council. The king ended the tense isolation abruptly. He summoned Elara to his study, a massive room lined with ancient maps and scrolls. "It's time, Alpha Elara," Kaelen announced, his golden eyes radiating absolute authority. He was near full strength now. The silver wounds were closed, and his aura was once again that crushing, majestic force. "Time for what, Your Majesty?" "The Grand Council," Kaelen stated, leaning over a map circling the capital. "I have enough loyalists in place. Thane's co-conspirators are isolated. The time for whispering is over. I will confront Thane's false reign publicly, denounce his treason, and assert my authority." He looked up, meeting her gaze, and the mate bond flared, hard and demanding. "And I will also formally announce my Luna." Elara's breath hitched. Luna, the queen, the ultimate political statement, the final step toward claiming full, unchallenged sovereignty. The idea of her, the disgraced, shadow-wielding exile standing beside the king, was preposterous, an insult to every law-abiding pack on the continent. "That is unwise, Your Majesty," Elara managed, forcing her voice to be steady. "To choose a mate from an exiled pack, one known for magic you condemn, it will be seen as instability. It will be a political liability that Thane will exploit." Kaelen's expression was unreadable. "Thane is exploiting my supposed death. Choosing my Luna is not about popularity, Elara. It's about absolute finality. A Luna is a source of power and legitimacy. The bond is already known in the high magic circles. To deny it now would show weakness, suggesting I am either too weak to embrace the bond or too unstable to choose a mate. I will not give Thane that opening." He was using her as a shield and a statement, a weapon of political shock. Elara was not being honored. She was being deployed. "You will stand beside me," Kaelen commanded, the alpha resonance absolute. "You will not hide in the shadows anymore. You will face the world that rejected you." The arrival of the serpent. Elara spent the next hour preparing for the worst, which, given their circumstances, was truly saying something. She was trying to fit Lyra and Kael into clothes that didn't make them look like bandits, while simultaneously battling the mate bond's insistent pull. Then, a royal guard appeared at their door, carrying a silver-edged scroll, a direct correspondence to the king. "Alpha Elara," the guard said. "The king requests your immediate counsel. A messenger has just arrived." Elara arrived in the study to find Kaelen standing rigid, the scroll clutched in his hand. His power, usually controlled, was radiating frustration and cold fury. "Read this," Kaelen commanded, thrusting the parchment toward her. The script was precise, the tone self-righteous. It was a formal petition to the crown addressed to the temporary council, delivered by a wolf claiming to be a victim of the recent instability. Elara read the signature. Her vision blurred, but the letters remained cruelly distinct. Damon, former Sunstone Alpha. The message read, "To the esteemed council, I, Damon, an aggrieved former officer and victim of the king's previous misjudgment, have critical intelligence regarding the recent instability. I have been tracking the source of the rot, and believe I must personally warn the king about the dangers currently lurking within the royal guard. Dangers that include the use of forbidden, disruptive magic that threatens the very stability of our realm. I will attend the Grand Council to make my testimony public and pledge my support to the true crown." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. It wasn't just Damon, it was the trap. The setup. "Damon is a fool," Kaelen said, his voice a low growl. "He thinks he can use this moment of chaos to buy his way back into favor. He is a traitor and a liability." "No, Your Majesty," Elara interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp, terrifying clarity. "Damon is not coming to pledge loyalty. He is coming to expose me." Kaelen stopped, his golden eyes narrowing. "Explain." "Damon was my mate, Your Majesty. The bond was weak, but it was there. When I developed my shadow magic, he was the first to condemn me. He betrayed me to the Sunstone Alpha, securing his own promotion while I was exiled." She slammed her hand down on the map. "He knows I saved you. He knows my pack is composed entirely of wolves with chaotic, forbidden magic. He knows the one law you cannot publicly break is the decree against shadow magic. Damon isn't trying to warn you about Thane. He's coming to prove I used shadow magic to save your life." The realization hit Kaelen like a physical blow. He looked from the scroll to Elara and finally back to the map, seeing the plot laid out like a strategic ambush. Damon's plan was brilliant in its cruelty. Expose the king's weakness. By publicly detailing how Elara, an exile, saved Kaelen using forbidden magic, Damon proves the king violated his own laws and is therefore unfit to rule. Sever the mate bond. This would give Thane, the royal beta, the political ammunition to turn the loyalist packs against Kaelen, claiming he is magically tainted. Gain vengeance. Damon would finally secure his petty, decade-long revenge against Elara by ensuring her execution. "The Grand Council is the stage for his betrayal," Elara hissed. "He knows your pride won't allow you to execute me before the announcement, but he will ensure you have no choice afterward." Kaelen's immense power seemed to swell, filling the room with a pressure that bent the light. He was enraged, not just by the threat to his reign, but by the malice aimed at his mate. "He sets a trap," Kaelen confirmed, the mate bond thrumming with shared lethal focus. "And he is using your past to do it." The vow Elara looked down at the scroll, the self-pity she hadn't allowed herself in a decade finally bubbling up, the shame, the betrayal, the fear of the executioner's block. She could feel the instinctual, crippling urge to shift and run, to melt into the shadows and take her pack back to the cold, safe anonymity of Haven. She slammed the scroll onto the desk, her eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering defiance. "No," Elara whispered, the word growing into a defiant roar that commanded even the king's attention. "I spent 10 years running from the consequences of his betrayal. I built a sanctuary for the wolves he cast out. I saved the king who can execute me. I will not let Damon, the weakest wolf I have ever known, dictate my fate again." She looked Kaelen in the eye, the mate bond a raging fire of shared determination. "He wants a public confrontation? He will have one," Elara vowed. "He wants to expose the Shadow Crest? Fine. We are done hiding. I will stand by you, Your Majesty. We will walk into that council, and we will show them that the greatest threat to this kingdom is not the shadow magic that heals, but the treason that hides behind the light." Kaelen stared at her, a flicker of something close to awe replacing the political calculation in his eyes. "Then we shall meet his play, Luna," Kaelen said, his voice now a statement of war. "Let the Grand Council begin. He sets the trap. We will detonate it. The gilded cage was about to open, and the Shadow Crest was about to walk into the brightest, most dangerous light on the continent. The final confrontation with Damon was nigh. Chapter 8. The Great Hall Showdown. The morning of the Grand Council was deceptively bright. Sunlight streamed through the cathedral windows of the Great Hall, catching the polished granite and the gleam of the assembled Alpha's ceremonial silver. It was a day for majesty, for order, and for absolute, pristine appearances. Elara felt none of it. She felt the cold sweat on Kael's palms as he stood guard behind her. The nervous energy radiating off Lyra and the suffocating weight of the silks she was forced to wear. She was a shadow wolf, trapped in a lighthouse. Kaelen stood at her side, magnificent and terrifying. His suit was dark, regal, and severe. The mate bond between them was a physical connection, a humming, white-hot wire of shared tension. He was her only anchor, yet he was also the ultimate threat. The entrance Elara and the Shadow Crest entered the hall last, following Kaelen. The moment they crossed the threshold, the low murmur of the assembled alphas died instantly. It wasn't the king they were staring at. It was her. The atmosphere was not merely suspicious, it was thick with palpable judgmental shock. They saw her severe features, the dark, rich quality of her fur even in human form, and the grim, feral intensity of her small contingent. They were a pack of scarred, silent wolves whose magic smelled wrong to the pristine alphas of the capital. Elara refused to lower her gaze. She walked with the fierce pride of the Alpha of Haven, not the shame of the exiled Omega. Every step was a defiance against the decade of rejection. Kaelen led her directly to the dais. The political theater was agonizingly precise. He did not introduce her as his Luna yet. She stood slightly behind him, identified only by the mate bond that many of the high-ranking wolves could feel resonating between them, a blatant, unnerving fact that spoke volumes without a single word. Kaelen's address. Kaelen began his address. His voice was a physical force, effortlessly commanding the attention of every wolf present. "Alphas of the United Territories," Kaelen began, his gaze sweeping over the hall. "I stand before you to end the uncertainty sown by the traitor, Royal Beta Thane. I confirm that Thane attempted to assassinate the crown and seize power while the kingdom believed me dead. He is now stripped of all titles and will be hunted as a fugitive." The hall erupted in a shocked wave of murmurs and gasps. Kaelen let the tension build, his eyes like gold fire. He spoke of stability, of law, and of the need for swift, absolute loyalty to prevent further chaos. Then he reached the inevitable second point. "To ensure the absolute stability of the crown," Kaelen announced, his eyes locking onto Elara, "I must address a matter of lineage and power. I declare today the beginning of a new era. I have accepted the bond of my destined mate, and I present her to you now as your future Luna." The challenge. Before Kaelen could complete the sentence, before he could utter Elara's name, the door to the side entrance burst open. A wolf staggered in, covered dramatically in dust and looking deliberately distraught. He was handsome in a weak, soft way, wearing the colors of a former Sunstone officer. It was Damon. "Your Majesty!" Damon shouted, his voice ringing with false righteousness. "Wait! You cannot make this announcement! I appeal to the Great Council! I have information vital to the survival of the crown! Information regarding the very truth of the king's rescue!" The hall went utterly silent, the gasps of shock at Kaelen's announcement immediately replaced by the electric tension of a public challenge. Damon had walked right into the middle of the political play. Kaelen's face remained a mask of controlled fury. He looked at Damon with the cold disdain reserved for vermin. "You are a former officer, Damon. You forfeited your right to address the crown in this hall when you deserted your post. You are a fugitive and a suspect in Thane's conspiracy. Step down or face immediate arrest." Damon, emboldened by the silent support he felt from the assembled alphas who clearly wanted to hear his accusations, stood his ground. He turned, pointing a trembling, dramatic finger at Elara. "Your Majesty, I come only for truth. I know this wolf. I know her past. She is not fit to stand beside the crown. She is cursed." The cursed Omega. Damon didn't just accuse, he performed. He spat out every shameful detail of Elara's life like poison. 10 years ago, she was an Omega, a wolf without rank or worth. I, Damon, in my duty to the Sunstone Pack, was burdened with the weak bond of her destiny. But she became tainted. He stepped closer, his voice rising to a fever pitch. She began to manifest the foulest, most forbidden of arts, shadow magic, the unstable, destructive energy. She was stripped of her rank, cast out as a fugitive, and exiled to the Whisperwood to live among the broken things. She is a magic-wielding fugitive, and her entire pack is a coven of shadow-using misfits. The hall erupted. Shock waves of outrage, disbelief, and horror washed over the assembly. The loyalist alphas, who already hated Elara, now had undeniable public proof of her transgression from a credible, if tainted, source. A shadow wolf Luna? The king saved by forbidden arts? The whispers rose to a near riot. Damon's final accusation was perfectly timed. "King Kaelen, the wolf who saved you is a walking contradiction of your own laws. You risked the life of the entire continent by associating with this curse. The only way to prove your absolute dedication to the purity of the territories is to execute the Shadow Wolf immediately." The trap was sprung. Damon had given the hostile factions a voice, and he had put Kaelen into an impossible position. Uphold the law and execute his mate, or betray the law and lose the throne. The silent king. Elara stood alone on the dais. The roar of the hall was deafening, the judgment of the alphas a crushing weight. She could feel the shame, the horror, and the political triumph of her enemies. She forced her body not to tremble. She had vowed not to run. She stared down Damon, and in her eyes was not fear, but a cold, lethal promise of vengeance. Her gaze shifted to Kaelen. He had remained utterly silent. He hadn't defended her name, nor had he refuted the accusations. He simply stood there, immense and statuesque, watching Elara as the entire kingdom screamed for her death. This was the moment of truth. This was where the mate bond met the royal law. This was the terrifying, silent question that hung in the air. What is more important to the king? The law he swore to uphold, or the mate he swore to protect? Elara knew that whatever came next, a defense, a denial, or a death sentence, it was hers to own. She had walked into the fire, and she would not back down. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, positioning herself slightly ahead of Kaelen, ready to confront Damon and the entire hall. This is the grand climax, the culmination of the mate bond, the political maneuvering, and Elara's deep-seated trauma. Kaelen's move must be swift, shocking, and irreversible. Here is the expanded Chapter 9, The King's Masterstroke. Chapter 9, The King's Masterstroke. The Great Hall was a deafening vortex of chaos. Alphas screamed for Elara's execution. Damon stood triumphant, the picture of self-righteous fury. Elara stood firm, preparing for the final, devastating rejection, the moment the love of her life would choose the law over his destiny. Kaelen stood beside her, silent, still, and radiating a power so immense it felt like the air itself was condensing around the dais. Silence of the sovereign. Just as Elara was about to meet Damon's gaze and deliver her own fiery condemnation, Kaelen moved. It wasn't a visible movement, but a sudden, violent expansion of his alpha aura. Crash. The force was instantaneous and absolute. It wasn't just power, it was sovereignty. The sound of the screaming alphas died in their throats as Kaelen's aura slammed into them, crushing the air from their lungs and pressing them back, not with physical force, but with the sheer, undeniable weight of his supreme authority. The hall plunged into a sudden, shocked silence. Damon, mid-sneer, found his voice stolen, his limbs paralyzed. Kaelen turned to Elara. In a world that had just been reduced to absolute stillness, he gently took her hand. The mate bond flared, the most profound moment of connection they had ever shared, filling Elara's terror with a grounding magnetic heat. Kaelen looked out over the assembly, now trembling with fear and submission, and finally spoke. His voice was calm, deep, and final. "Let there be order," the king commanded, "and let there be truth." The ultimate twist. He lifted Elara's hand, presenting her to the shocked assembly. "Damon speaks the truth," Kaelen stated, his voice resonating with unchallenged authority. "This is Elara, an exile, the alpha of the Shadow Crest, a wolf who wields forbidden power." He paused, letting the statement sink in, watching the alphas gasp again. "He accuses her of using shadow magic, and again, he speaks the truth. When the traitor Thane left me bleeding out with silver poisoning, it was Alpha Elara and her cursed pack who stabilized my life force. They defied the law of the land to save the king of the land." Kaelen smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that promised both reward and ruin. And Damon, in his eagerness to play the hero, reveals only his own ignorance. "I did not discover her truth upon my arrival here. I knew of her power from the moment our bond was struck at her side as I lay dying." The hall was silent, stunned. Kaelen had known. He had accepted her. "I am the sovereign," Kaelen proclaimed, his voice growing in power. "And I alone determine the threat of a power. Where the blind see chaos, I see control. Where others see shadow binding, I see potential. Purification, the moon-shielding guard." This was Kaelen's masterstroke, the move that legitimized Elara and simultaneously shattered the legal foundation of her enemies. He turned to Elara, pulling her close. "Alpha Elara," Kaelen declared, his voice a decree that would echo through the territories for centuries. "You are not an Omega, nor are you a fugitive. You are my queen, my Luna, and the shield of this kingdom." He used his ancient, inherent royal power, a unique, formidable magic of purification that had been passed down through the bloodline to maintain the magical health of the realm. He focused it, channeling the energy not to destroy Elara's shadow magic, but to redefine it. A shimmering silver-white light erupted from Kaelen's palm, washing over Elara and her pack. It wasn't painful. It was exhilarating, a sudden, powerful cleansing. The deep, heavy shadow magic that had clung to Elara for a decade suddenly shifted. It didn't vanish, but its essence transformed. The color deepened, gaining a rich, cool sheen, and its nature changed from binding to protection. "By my decree," Kaelen roared, his voice shaking the rafters, "the Shadow Crest is no more. They are now the moon-shielding guard. Their shadow-binding magic is hereby recognized as moon-shielding, a unique, potent, and legal defensive art, dedicated solely to the preservation of the crown." Elara felt the shift deep in her bones. She wasn't free of her power. She was freed by it. Her shadow was now an accepted, revered defense. Her exile was over. Her purpose was cemented. The traitors fall. The alphas were speechless. Kaelen had not only claimed a Luna, but he had legally and magically invented a new, powerful, loyal force, annihilating 10 years of prejudice with a single, devastating move. Kaelen then turned his attention to Damon, who was now weeping from the combined shame and the crushing pressure of the alpha aura. "Now, the true purpose of this meeting," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. "Damon came here to accuse my Luna of conspiracy. But he is merely the puppet of the true conspirator." Kaelen snapped his fingers. Kael, now standing taller and straighter, moved with the confidence of the newly legitimized guard. He handed Kaelen a packet of tightly bound scrolls, evidence Elara had helped him piece together from Thane's intercepted communications. The intelligence provided by My Luna revealed Damon's connection not only to Thane's recent coup, but to a 10-year-long campaign of orchestrated magical instability near the border pacts. Damon betrayed his Omega, then used his exile as a cover to work with Thane's network, destabilizing the territories and enriching himself with stolen magical artifacts. Kaelen slammed the evidence down. Damon's exile of Elara was the first step in Thane's plot to remove any wolf with high, untamable power. Damon is the key to the entire treason. The hall, recovering from the magical shift, erupted in righteous fury. Damon's credibility was shattered. He wasn't a hero. He was a petty, terrified tool of a massive conspiracy. "Take him!" Kaelen ordered. Before the guards could move, Damon, in a final act of desperation, lunged. He shifted into his wolf form, a small, pale animal compared to the surrounding alphas, and aimed a frantic snap at Elara's throat. Elara didn't hesitate. She didn't need to shift. A powerful, rich moon shield flared instantaneously around her, reflecting Damon's meager attack back at him. He slammed into the now shimmering barrier and fell back, whimpering. The Loyalists took him. Damon, the traitor who had orchestrated 10 years of Elara's misery, was dragged away, not as a hero, but as the whimpering proof of Thane's guilt. The Queen's acceptance. Kaelen stepped away from the dais, walking down the steps until he was face to face with the astonished assembly. He stood alone, his power absolute. He turned, walking back to Elara, who was now standing with an air of quiet, lethal confidence. He wasn't looking at the political threat anymore. He was looking at his mate, the queen he had just forged from the ashes of rejection. "Luna," Kaelen whispered, the term now loaded with respect, love, and absolute political power. "Your lawless existence has ended. Your destiny has begun." Elara finally allowed herself to feel the crushing weight of relief, love, and triumph. She looked out at the assembly. The wolves who had called her a curse were now bowing to her. She looked at Kaelen, the man who was supposed to execute her, and saw only the mate bond, whole and true. "The shadow is now the shield, Your Majesty," Elara replied, her voice strong and clear for the entire hall to hear. "The exile is now the queen. The great council is adjourned." The grand hall was no longer a gilded cage. It was her throne room. The battle for the crown was far from over, but the personal battle, the rejection, the shame, the fear of the shadow, was finally and decisively won. This is a powerful conclusion to this phase, establishing Elara as a legitimate and uniquely powerful figure in the new political landscape. It transitions perfectly into Part 3, which will now focus on the full-scale conflict with Thane. The final chapter summary provided by the user is the text for Part 3, The Political Gauntlet, which has been integrated into the narrative arc of Chapter 5. Given that this chapter marks the triumphant resolution of the internal conflict and the establishment of Elara's new role, I will provide a brief, satisfying closing statement to the user. Chapter 9. The King's Masterstroke. The collective fear and disgust aimed at Elara was a physical force, a crushing weight of judgment that threatened to buckle her knees. She felt the shame, the horror, and the sickening triumph in Damon's eyes. This was the end, the inevitable second rejection she had feared since she first laid eyes on King Kaelen. Silence of the sovereign. Just as Elara prepared to step forward and deliver her final, desperate defense, the air in the great hall snapped. Kaelen moved, not physically, but spiritually. His immense power, no longer contained by discretion or caution, erupted. The sheer, crushing force of his alpha aura slammed into the assembled wolves. It wasn't a warning, it was a sovereign command. Alphas, betas, and guards gasped, their knees trembling as the tidal wave of power demanded absolute stillness and obedience. Damon, mid-shout, found his voice stolen, his body frozen in a posture of impotent rage. The chaos was instantly, completely quelled. Kaelen then looked at Elara, a profound depth of emotion in his golden gaze. In a world reduced to absolute silence, he reached out and took her hand. The mate bond, now unrestricted, flared like a solar eruption, pouring conviction and heat into her core, silencing her decade-long terror of being unworthy. Kaelen looked out over the assembly, his voice deep, calm, and ringing with finality. "Let there be order," the king commanded, "and let there be truth." The ultimate twist. He lifted Elara's hand, presenting her not as a prisoner, but as a prize, standing above the silenced ranks of the realm. "Damon speaks the truth," Kaelen stated. "This is Elara, the Alpha of the Shadow Crest, a wolf who wields forbidden power." He paused, letting the statement hang. Damon, in his eagerness to play the hero, reveals only his own smallness. When the traitor Thane left me bleeding out with silver poisoning, it was Alpha Elara and her cursed pack who stabilized my life force. They defied the law of the land to save the king of the land. The assembly was rigid with confusion. Kaelen had known. "I am the sovereign," Kaelen proclaimed, his voice growing in power. "And I alone determine the threat of a power. I did not need to accept her power. I simply needed to observe it. Where others see chaos, I saw a discipline that rivals my own. Where they saw shadow binding, I saw potential. Purification, the moon-shielding guard." This was the king's masterstroke, the political and magical move that would rewrite the laws of the realm. Kaelen turned to Elara, pulling her close, resting his hand on her shoulder. "She is my mate," Kaelen declared, his command absolute. "She is my queen, and she is the shield of this kingdom." He channeled his ancient, inherent royal power, a unique, formidable magic of purification, passed down through the bloodline. A brilliant, silver-white light erupted from Kaelen, washing over Elara and her Shadow Crest wolves standing guard. The intense, cleansing light didn't destroy their shadow magic. It redefined it. The deep, heavy shadow energy that defined Elara was instantly transformed. It gained a rich, cool, resilient shimmer, shifting its nature from one of binding and hiding to one of absolute protection. "By my decree," Kaelen roared, his voice shaking the rafters. "The Shadow Crest is no more. They are now the moon-shielding guard. Their shadow-binding magic is hereby purified and recognized as moon-shielding, a unique, potent, and legal defensive art dedicated solely to the preservation of the crown." Elara felt the shift deep in her soul. She wasn't just safe, she was legitimate. Her exile was not rescinded, it was sanctified. The traitor's fall with Elara's status secured, Kaelen moved to crush the conspirators. He turned his attention to Damon, who was paralyzed by the psychological shock. "Damon came here to accuse my Luna of conspiracy," Kaelen said, his voice dropping to a glacial chill. "But he is merely the puppet of the true conspirator Thane." Kaelen snapped his fingers. Kael, now standing with the confidence of the newly legitimized guard, presented a packet of scrolls. "The intelligence provided by my Luna revealed Damon's long-term connection to Thane's network," Kaelen announced, using Elara's work as the final dagger. Damon's exile of Elara was the first step in Thane's plot, removing any wolf with high, untamable power to weaken the royal bloodline. Damon is the key to the entire treason. The hall, recovering from the magical shift, erupted in righteous fury. Damon's credibility was shattered. He wasn't a hero, he was a traitor. A pawn whose petty revenge had just cost him his life. "Take him," Kaelen ordered. Before the guards could move, Damon, in a final frantic lunge of pure spite, shifted into his wolf form and snapped at Elara's throat. Elara didn't flinch. She simply activated her moon shielding. A rich, dark barrier flared around her, a visible, tangible defense that sent Damon crashing back into the ranks of the now furious loyalists. He was seized and dragged away, his decade-long malice collapsing into the ignominy of treason. The Queen's reign. Kaelen stepped back to the dais, his energy radiating absolute triumph. He wasn't looking at the political threat anymore. He was looking at his mate, the Queen he had just forged from the ashes of rejection. "Luna," Kaelen whispered, the term now loaded with respect and absolute political power. "Your lawless existence has ended. Your destiny has begun." Elara met his gaze, the mate bond solid, true, and overwhelming. She felt the collective reverence of the moon-shielding guard behind her and the grudging, absolute acceptance of the alphas before her. "The shadow is now the shield, Your Majesty," Elara replied, her voice strong and clear. "The exile is now the Queen. The Great Council is adjourned." The Grand Hall was no longer a stage for her execution. It was her throne room. The political gauntlet had transformed her from a fugitive into the co-ruler of the territories, and the battle for the crown, the final war against the true traitor Thane, was officially about to begin. Chapter 10. The Unbreakable Crown. The silence in the Great Hall, moments after the seizure of Damon and the thunderous decree of the king, was the kind of silence that precedes an avalanche. The alphas of the continent, once screaming for the blood of the Shadow Wolf, now stared at the newly christened moon-shielding guard with a mixture of awe, terror, and dawning respect. Submitting to the new guard. The sight of the Shadow Crest, no, the moon-shielding guard, executing the arrest was a physical lesson in the new order. Kyle, their second-in-command, moved with the quiet, devastating efficiency Elara had taught him. The unique, purified magic of the guard flowed around them, a rich, protective sheen that made them look untouchable. Damon and the stunned co-conspirators of the former royal beta, Thane, were hauled away, their resistance pitiful against the focused power of the newly legitimized guard. Kaelen waited, allowing the image to sear itself into the minds of the assembly. He didn't need to shout. The truth of his power and Elara's loyalty was now undeniable. He had not bowed to the law. He had rewritten it. Kaelen turned, pulling Elara fully to his side, their hands linked over the ancient wolf seal etched into the dais. "The immediate threat is neutralized," Kaelen declared, his voice firm. "The true battle against the traitor Thane begins now. You, the alphas of this continent, have a choice. You may cling to the prejudices that nearly cost us the crown, or you may embrace the strength that saved it." One by one, the alphas, starting with the most powerful loyalists, dropped to one knee. They were not kneeling to Elara's shadow past. They were submitting to the unbreakable crown, symbolized by the king and the formidable queen at his side. The moon-shielding guard, once the exiled outcasts, were now the most powerful force in the kingdom. The acceptance. In the quiet aftermath, as the hall emptied of all but the most loyal and perhaps most terrified advisors, Elara finally let the weight of the moment settle. The decade of running, the pain of rejection, the shame of the shadow, it was gone, washed away by Kaelen's light and her own inner strength. She looked at Kaelen, his face softening from the stern mask of the sovereign to the unguarded look of her mate. The bond was now complete, a glorious, profound connection that felt like coming home after a terrible, decade-long journey. "You risked everything," Elara whispered, the realization immense. "You risked your throne and your life on my loyalty." "I knew the cost," Kaelen replied, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "But I also knew the worth. My laws were flawed, forged in fear of power I didn't understand. You taught me the difference between chaos and unlicensed control. A king must be willing to learn from his queen." Elara smiled, a genuine, fierce expression that transformed her face. She was no longer the frightened wolf seeking shelter. She was Queen Elara Luna, the shield of the kingdom, the dawn of reform. The days and weeks that followed were relentless, but glorious. While Kaelen prepared the troops and logistics for the full-scale conflict against Thane, Elara seized the opportunity to reform the kingdom from the inside out. Her first act was to draft the Moonlight Edict. The edict didn't just legalize the moon-shielding magic. It fundamentally redefined the concept of power within the kingdom. It established protections for latent, volatile, or previously exiled wolves, creating specialized training facilities, run, of course, by the moon-shielding guard, where dangerous magic was channeled into useful, controlled arts. Strength is not defined by purity of lineage, but by the control of one's power. No wolf shall be cast out for their unique magical signature. The kingdom shall embrace all who swear loyalty to the crown, for even the deepest shadow, when turned to the light, becomes the strongest shield. Elara used her own history as the guiding force. She ensured that the misfits, the broken, and the volatiles were now recognized as a strategic asset, transforming the very definition of a vulnerable wolf into a hidden potential. Lyra, whose fire once threatened to burn her down, became the head instructor for energy control, a calm, potent mentor to younger wolves. Kyle, whose tremors made him unstable, became the master strategist, using his earth magic to feel and map the kingdom's terrain with uncanny accuracy. A symbol of righteous authority, Elara's new position transformed her physical appearance into a powerful symbol. The trauma that had once been hidden was now a celebrated fact. Her white hair, once a mark of the cursed Omega, now contrasted starkly with her potent moon-shielding magic, becoming a visible representation of her unique resilience and her sovereign authority. When she walked the halls, she no longer walked in a gilded cage. She walked as the queen, surrounded by the quiet vigilance of her guard. Her gaze was not one of fear, but of profound, protective strength. The established packs, who had initially resisted the changes, quickly realized the benefit. The kingdom was stronger, more unified, and less volatile than it had been in decades. They had a queen who understood the shadows, and a king who had the courage to follow her into the light. The Shadow Crest, the moon-shielding guard, became the ultimate symbol of the unbreakable crown. They were a constant, visible reminder that the king was willing to tear down tradition to protect his people and his queen. Elara had not just accepted her place. She had solidified it forever. She was no longer defined by Damon's betrayal or the Sunstone's rejection. She was defined by the strength of her will, the power of her unique magic, and the absolute unwavering love of her king. The battle against Thane would be long and difficult, but as Elara stood on the parapets of the citadel with Kaelen by her side, watching her moon-shielding guard prepare for the final confrontation, she knew the ultimate victory was already hers. She had won her destiny, and in doing so, had healed the heart of the entire kingdom. Now, before you go, let us know where you're watching us from. And if you'd like to watch the Part